Greetings, friends. My name is Peter, and this is Retro Unscripted. As always, I am honored and grateful that you've taken the time to join me for this as well as any other episodes that you've watched. I hope you'll enjoy what you're about to see. This is episode 23, and over the last couple of episodes, I've broken down my life as it pertains to gaming over the years from 1972 through 1990. That was episode 21. And then 1990 through right around now, 1995 in episode 22. So here we are, episode 23. And the game that you see behind you, which is Ridge Racer, is a game that really changed the way that I looked at consoles. See, I played Ridge Racer for the first time at an independent video game store. I went to a grand opening gala, although you really can't call it that because it really wasn't that fancy. But the owner of the video game store brought me over to this thing called a PlayStation. It was an import model, and he said, "Here, I want you to try this game." So he put Ridge Racer in, and I'm like, okay, this is a racing game. But I was surprised by how fast it was and how the frame rate was so much better than games with polygons that I'd seen in the past. Games like Star Fox for the Super Nintendo and Virtual Racing for the Sega Genesis. This blew those out of the water. Granted, it was 30 frames a second and not quite silky smooth, but still it was fast, fast, fast. And because it's in arcade style, I fell in love with it. As a matter of fact, I played the game for no less than an hour. And at that point, during a April, May, I forget which month it was off the top of my head, but from that point on, I knew that a PlayStation was something that I had to have. So when the PlayStations went up for pre-order, I pre-ordered mine from Electronics Boutique in the Holyoke Mall in Holyoke, Massachusetts. And this is where the trade-ins that I was talking about in the last episode started to figure in. I traded in a lot of games and a couple of systems that I had because PlayStation is what I wanted. And even though I was again working for a living, I wasn't making a lot of money, and affording $300 for the console plus $50 per game, the memory card, and other things that I would need, I needed to trade some things in to offset the cost. But I figured because it's the new thing, it would be totally worth it. With about 3 weeks left before the system was scheduled to launch on September 9th, I had already paid the system off. So when I did that, and those of you who were around for the PlayStation launch remember the developer's demo disc that people got when they paid off their pre-orders, where it was a music CD at first. It was black on the bottom. If you haven't seen, and I'm sure you have, but if you haven't seen a PlayStation disc before, PlayStation discs are black at the bottom. They're not the standard gray kind of reflective surface. They're all black at the bottom. So I remember Korn's "Blind" was on there. There were a couple of other songs on there that escape me currently. But I listened to this because it's all you could do. You knew that you had a disc. You knew it was going to do some weird things when you put it in the PlayStation, but you had to wait for September 9th to roll around. So when September 9th finally did roll around, I had taken that day off from work, and I drove down to the mall. I went to Electronics Boutique maybe 5 to 10 minutes after they opened, and I was ready to pick up my system. I bought 2 games that day, Ridge Racer, and also NBA Jam Tournament Edition, which is an arcade game, as you've seen if you've watched earlier episodes of Retro Unscripted, one of my favorite arcade games of all time. Not quite the original NBA Jam, which is my personal favorite, but still very close to the arcade, promises of scaling players and saving statistics and the true at-home arcade experience. I had to have it. So I got my system, I got my games, I picked up my memory card, I was ready. I went home, and I went upstairs to my bedroom. I was back at my grandmother's house, as you'll recall, because I was back to saving money after being laid off from AT&T. So I set it up to my Zenith TV, and I'm ready. I turn the power on, I have the disc in there, crank up the volume, you get that big deep bass sound, which is the PlayStation boot up sound. You probably remember it. And then when the game started to play, the vertical hold seemed to be broken. The picture would kind of bounce up and down. And I thought, maybe it's the game, maybe I didn't hook it up properly. So I tried it again, made sure I tried to set it up again, made sure I followed all the instructions and everything, and I still ran into the same problem. Did this 3 times before I got frustrated and I said, you know what, I'm bringing this thing back. I don't know what's going on. So I drove all the way back from my grandmother's house back to Electronics Boutique with my system, and I said, you sold me a lemon, give me another. Well, how can your system be broken? I said, I don't know how it's broken, just I want another system. I paid money for this, I've been waiting for this, I took the day off from work for this, give me my system. So I got another system, I went home, went through the whole process again, I'm like, no problem, right? Same thing. So I went back to the independent video game store that I saw the import PlayStation at, and I asked him, I said, have you heard about any systems having this problem? He said, no. He gave me an RF adapter thinking I could hook it up that way rather than using the composite cables. And I still had the same problem. So at that point I had to call Sony, not an easy thing to do on launch day. And Sony was befuddled. They didn't know what was going on. They said I could send it back into them if I wanted to, or I could just return it to get another one. So, out of frustration, I took the system out of my room. I brought it down to the family room, and when I set the system up down there on that TV, which was not a Zenith TV, the picture was fine. As it turns out, we found out a few weeks later that Sony PlayStations had compatibility issues with certain Zenith televisions, and I happen to have one of the ones that it didn't agree with. So that's kind of how I got the GX TV here. Obviously, I couldn't keep the PlayStation set up in the living room because I had to split time with my grandmother, and that just wasn't convenient for either of us. So I wound up buying the GX TV shortly after it came out, and I've had it ever since. So you figure that was late 1996. So that's 18 years about that I've had this TV, and it's still running as well as it is today. So I'm pretty impressed with that. So those of you who are asking about the GX TV and how I got it, that's how. I knew that I had to get another TV, a gaming TV, and this is what I wound up with. I bought that from Electronics Boutique as well. And suffice it to say, although it's not quite as sharp as it once was, the sound on the GX is phenomenal. I did a whole episode on it. So if you want to check that out, you certainly can. But that's how I wound up with that TV. But I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit. The PlayStation does use compact disc technology, which I was familiar with during my time with the Sega CD, the TurboGrafx CD, and also my limited amount of time in which I had a 3DO. When you first bought PlayStation games shortly after launch and for a little while afterwards, the games came in cases, long box cases that look like this. They came in 3 different varieties. This one here is a cardboard case, and when you open it up, there should be and unfortunately this didn't come with it, there's usually like a styrofoam divider in there, but you get the disc, which is up here, you get the manual here, and then the styrofoam divider is like right in here. So that's the first variation of long box cases. The second kind of case, and Konami had these, were cases that were like snap cases. And I'll open this up so you can see. Again, here's the manual, here's the styrofoam divider, and then the disc is underneath. These, if you can find games that are like these, tend to hold up the best, although sometimes right along the spine, the spine will tend to lift off if the glue is degrading, so kind of keep that in mind. My copy of Bottom of the Ninth actually does that. And then the last variation, and the one that is... Sorry about that. The one that I worry about the most because they're so flimsy are like these plastic cases here. This is Bust a Move 2 here. And this plastic tends to break a lot like the common jewel cases. But again, if you open it up, and this doesn't have it in the middle, but you get your manual here, and then your styrofoam kind of goes in the middle here where these 2 fingers are, and then here's the disc. So these took up a lot of room, kind of like 3DO discs took up a lot of room. And then eventually they went back to jewel cases like you see underneath Ridge Racer. This is the greatest hits version of Ridge Racer that I have running right now, and that made PlayStation CDs a lot easier to manage. Now you could either keep the cases, which is normally what I did, or you could get yourself a CD wallet, get rid of the cases. I know some people that did that, and that makes it a lot easier to store them without taking up a lot of room. I do that now for my PlayStation 2 loose discs, but I'll get to that in the next episode. So, from 1995 until 1999, really, the PlayStation was my primary system of choice. I did buy a Nintendo 64 in late September of 1996. The 64 was something I stumbled upon. I wasn't really going to get one at launch, but when I went into a local electronics chain called Lechmere, some of you might remember that, there was one Nintendo 64 system left. And kind of like the Street Fighter 2 situation that I explained in the last episode, when there's only one of something left, uh, your um, your emotions kind of get the best of you. You tend to be a bit more impulsive. So I bought the Nintendo 64 along with Super Mario 64 and Pilot Wings 64, and that's how my Nintendo 64 career started. The Nintendo 64 never got as much play as the PlayStation did, although the Nintendo 64 was instrumental in 1996, or I should say 1997. Um, During that time, late 96 through early 1997, my paternal grandmother, the one that I had been living with for so long, she was diagnosed with cancer, had to go into hospice, and did die. Um, and because she and I were so close, losing her was a big blow to my confidence, a big blow to me as far as just, what am I going to do now? I felt alone. And it was playing games like Super Mario 64 and Pilot Wings, and I wound up getting Wayne Gretzky's 3D hockey. During that particular time period when I was struggling the most, it just turns out that the Nintendo 64 was a system that was there for me. I played that a bit more than the PlayStation at that time. So when I pop in Super Mario 64 now, uh, hearing like Dire Dire Docks, for example, the underwater stage music, I always remember sitting in that chair, playing that game, and trying to fight back tears, trying to find some escape, somewhere else to go where it didn't feel so bad, it didn't hurt so much. And that's really what I remember the Nintendo 64 for the most. By the time 1997 really blossomed in full and games like Star Fox 64 had come out, I was still firmly back in the PlayStation camp, playing games like Parappa the Rapper, Castlevania Symphony of the Night, Ace Combat 2, Colony Wars, Street Fighter EX Plus Alpha. These were games that I always kept coming back to, and it just turned out that the PlayStation was the system that I was my go-to for a good number of years, even after the next console generation had begun. As far as favorite PlayStation games go, obviously Ridge Racer, the Ridge Racer series are some of my favorites. Air Combat and Ace Combat 2 are favorites. Um, I'm trying to think of some off the top of my head. Metal Gear Solid, of course, is a favorite. There are just so many that I could list, and that's why I'm still very, very happy to have these games in my library that I can pop into my PlayStation 2 at any point and be able to play them through. Unfortunately, I don't have an original PlayStation anymore. It's something that I've been looking to add to my retro library if I happen to find one that works really well. There's just something about playing a PlayStation game on the original hardware as opposed to playing it on the smaller PS1, which isn't quite the same, at least not to me. And especially playing them on PlayStation 2, where there are some emulation issues and graphics issues. Not something major, but things that if you remember playing the games in their original state, you'll definitely notice it. playing them on the PS2 as I do now. I tend to let it go because it's more convenient, but I'd more rather play the games on the original gray box, even if you do have to turn it upside down to get them to play right. So that's PlayStation versus Nintendo 64. I'm certainly happy to have games from both systems, and I play them quite a lot. I know that there's a sense that games from that particular generation, the 32, 64-bit generation, don't hold up very well. Graphically, especially the PlayStation games tend to be too jaggy. The textures tend to warp. I don't look at it in that sense. I still enjoy playing the games as much as I did. And again, as with other systems from the past, there's specific signposts, there's specific doorways to periods in my life that I choose either to remember or choose to look back on and try and keep in my mind. And obviously, Ridge Racer is one of those. So, PlayStation and Nintendo 64 were the systems that I had from 1995 or 96 for the 64 all the way up until 1999. In 1999, I was back visiting my buddy who owns a video game store, and he brings me in and he says, I want to show you something. Now, if you remember the last time he said he wanted to show me something, he sold me on a PlayStation. So he brings me into this, not a room, but kind of like a cubicle. He had certain cubicles set up to play consoles in. You could rent time. So if you want to play games on a PlayStation or a Nintendo 64 or an NES or whatever systems he had running, you could certainly do that. So he brings me back there and he says, did you have a 32X? He asks me the question, and I said, yes, I hated it. I only had 2 games for it, and I wound up trading it towards my PlayStation anyway. Okay. Did you have a Sega CD, he said, or he asked, and I said, yes. There were some games I liked for it, and there were other games that I didn't. I wish there were more. So what do you think about Sega, he asked me. I said, well, I don't miss them. I was kind of blunt and honest. I really felt burned after the 32X, and the Sega CD really didn't do much for me. I'd spent a fair amount of money on those, and they didn't pan out. He said, well, prepare to have your socks blown off. And he sits me down, and he turns on this system, and there's this swirl. Looks kind of like this right here. And it was, and it says, it's Sega Dreamcast, or it said Dreamcast, I believe is what it said. And I kind of looked at him, and I said, what are you doing? He walked away. He's like, you're going to love it. And that's when I was introduced to Sonic Adventure, which blew me away, just as he promised that it would. If you remember playing games in the 32, 64-bit generations and then seeing something like Sonic Adventure for the first time with more, with cleaner textures and more detailed graphics, and just how fast that Sonic Adventure ran, it was hard to deny how cool the game was. And since I'm being honest, the cheesiest thing about it, the music is really what caught me. That Japanese rock, those wailing guitars, the 80s type vocals really just kind of drew me in. And then playing through the first stage of Sonic Adventure and having Killer Whale jumping in the air after you, and all these other really cool things that happened just in the first stage alone. And I knew at that point, just as I did in the spring of 1995, that a Dreamcast was, much to my surprise, something that I had to own. So, for the next few months, I set more money aside and I traded more things in. And on September 9th of 1999, I went all in on a Sega Dreamcast. And what I mean by all in is that I spent more than $700 between games, accessories, and the system itself. A lot of that was store credit, but some of it was cash out of pocket. I wound up getting the Dreamcast. I wound up getting 1 extra controller. I wound up getting 3 VMU units. And then for games, I wound up getting Sonic Adventure, Hydro Thunder, NFL Blitz 2000, Ready to Rumble. Let's see what else I can remember here. Flag to Flag, NFL 2K, Soul Calibur I got shortly thereafter. I just went completely nuts because I was so sold on the system. I thought at that time this was the future. The Sega Dreamcast is the future. Online play, which is something that hadn't really been done before. Much better visuals. The Sega pedigree as far as Sega arcade games go. It wasn't long before we got versions of Virtua Tennis and Crazy Taxi, which were just fantastic. And we also got some third-party support here and there, not a ton of it. Electronic Arts didn't support it, Square didn't support it. But where Electronic Arts failed, Sega's sports division, headed by Visual Concepts, certainly picked up the slack with great versions of football, basketball, hockey, and an okay version of baseball. And then other third parties like THQ and Acclaim, Midway was huge for it, really provided all the support that I was interested in. And if you're an arcade rat like I am, the Dreamcast was really the last great arcade game system that we had. If you think about all of the arcade ports that we wound up getting from Sega, from Midway, from Capcom, it was fantastic. It was a great time to be an arcade fan and also have a system like that, which is why I was just crazy for it and went absolutely nuts. So the Nintendo 64 wound up getting pushed way, way off to the side, and I wound up splitting time between my Dreamcast and my PlayStation. PlayStation, of course, still chugging away at that time. 1999, and especially during 2000, Squaresoft's output in 2000 was just ridiculous. You had Chrono Cross, you had Final Fantasy IX, you had Vagrant Story, you had Threads of Fate, you had... I think I'm remembering all these dates right. If I'm wrong, you can correct me in the comments. I think there was also Legend of Mana that year. So just in RPGs alone, it was a huge year. And then you had Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 2, which was the sequel to Tony Hawk's Pro Skater, which I spent hours and hours and hours playing. It was just a great time. The late 1990s, like 1999, all the way up through like 2001. I really didn't have a lot to complain about. Except oh boy. In early 2001, Sega did something that was completely unexpected. And after all of the goodwill, that had been repaired, after rebuilding the bridges that had been burned, and just completely going Sega nuts and being a big Sega fan again for months and months and months, there was a decision made in 2001 in January that just leveled me and devastated me as a game player. I think you know what it is that I'm talking about, and that is where we will pick up episode 24 next time. Until then, feel free to note in the comments about your own PlayStation, Nintendo 64, and Dreamcast experiences. I'd like to hear from you, so you can tell me about when you were introduced to these systems, what you thought of them, what your favorite games were. I'd love to talk to you guys back and forth about those, because now we're at the period of time where just about everybody who's online can remember these systems when they were first launched. And I'd love to be able to have conversations with you guys and get more information from you as to what your experiences were like. So leave them in the comments below, or maybe talk to me on Twitter at Retro1Scripted, and let me know about your PlayStation, your Nintendo 64, and your Dreamcast experiences. And let's match heads. Let's see what you played and what I didn't play. I'd love to hear it. That's all for this episode of Retro Unscripted. Again, this was episode 23. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. And I will see you on the next episode of Retro Unscripted on my birthday, April 22nd of next week. Take care.